Hello my friends, and welcome to the study. This evening, for All Hallows Eve in the study, we're going to go to 3 masquerade balls. There will be costumes, disguises, and masks. And as it is with all masked balls, there will be themes of hidden identity, the supernatural, spirits, and the grotesque. Nothing is as it might seem. But don't worry, you're completely safe here in the study. As we go on an adventure, we will be looking at books and listening to stories and history from Alexandre Dumas to Edgar Allan Poe to Jean Froissart. We'll be seeing art of Arthur Rackham, his ink and wash illustrations that conjure up all kinds of Hallows Eve images, and some things from the Duc de Berry and a ball he attended in France in the 14th century. We'll be seeing wild men and depravity, immorality, and lots of costumes. We'll even cut out some of our own little costumed figures and place them in our own masked ball. So relax and come with me on a trip into the imagination. Masquerade balls might be said to have origins with the Commedia dell'arte, that Italian theatre with Pulcinello and Harlequin, as it is in French, the puppets that we see at the Palais Luxembourg, or indeed even in pantomime that pervades holiday scenes in Britain today. This in turn had roots in the Greek theatre and manifested itself among other ways in medieval religious plays and feast day pageants. The height of it was 15th century Venice and Carnival, which involved ever increasingly elaborate allegorical costumes, royal pageants, triumphal processions that would celebrate anything from marriages to events of state. And they encompassed medieval court life in Italy. The costumed dances were a special luxury of the ducal court of Burgundy, which we shall see soon. Masked balls, as they were, became popular throughout mainland Europe through the 17th and 18th centuries. However, some of them had intrigue and even murder. Gustav III of Sweden was assassinated at a masquerade ball in 1792. Such an intriguing event caught the public imagination, and it became the subject of several operas. Gustav III by Auber, and Verdi's A Masked Ball, Un ballo maschera. At the beginning of the 18th century, a Swiss count gets the credit for introducing London to the Venetian fashion of semi-public masquerade balls, to which subscriptions could be bought. The first being held at Haymarket Opera House and in London's public gardens such as Vauxhall. that provided outdoor settings where characters masked and in fancy dress mingled with the crowds. It was a sensation, and the masquerade ball and fancy dress parties took off and became one of the most popular events that one could attend throughout the 18th, the 19th, and even into the 20th centuries. The Paris Opera gave one annually and still does. These masked balls developed a reputation for unseemly behavior, being the scene of all kinds of hijinks, including having unescorted women, debauchery, drunkenness, extravagance, and people with masks who act with impunity. Such became the reputation of the masquerades that significant anti-masquerade movements grew in England alongside the balls themselves. Some writers denouncing such activities, notably Samuel Richardson, wrote that these events encouraged immorality and foreign influence. Guests at masked balls were normally dressed so that no one could recognize them, and sometimes it was a game to see who could figure out the identity of the people behind the mask. Alexandre Dumas, intrigued by the immoral reputation of these masked balls, and no doubt enjoying many himself, wrote a short story called The Masked Ball in 1835. He writes how one night, late, his friend came to the door, Monsieur Antony. Dumas was not going to let him in because of the late hour, but Antony was very upset. He came in, and Dumas, Alexandre, could see how pale he was. "Why, what is the matter with you? Whatever has happened?" asked Alexandre. Antony began to tell him, "Perhaps it is a dream, or maybe I am mad. I've been to Père Lachaise cemetery. Oh, that accursed masked ball. Something extraordinary has happened to me," Antony said. "You remember the opera ball where I last met you?" "Yes," Alexandre said. "Well?" Antony told him. "After leaving you, I was feeling bored, lonely, and depressed, so I decided to go to the Variété, which I had been told was notorious curiosity to be visited just to see what depths our society can sink. Oh, why did I ever go? The place was crowded with men and women of the streets, God knows what else, all cavorting around like dervishes. I went up one of the staircases, leaning against a pillar. I looked down over this sea of scarcely human beings, all in grotesque dominoes, all leaping and thrashing around to the strains of a band which could hardly be heard through their obscure shrieks, yells, laughs, and cries. You should have seen them. They caught hold of each other by the hands, the arms, the neck. A huge circle was formed, men and women stamping their feet, throwing up above the dim clouds of dust caught by the pale light of the chandeliers, circling at growing speed with obscure posturings, suggestive gestures and cries. Quicker and quicker they circled, swaying backward like drunken men, howling like lost women, delirious rather than joyous, more furious than gratified. They were like a chain gang of lost souls, performing an infernal penance under the lashes of demons. All this din, All this hum, this confusion, this music, were in my head as much as in the hall. I soon came to doubt whether what was before my eyes was dream or reality. I asked myself whether it was not I who was mad, and they reasonable. Strange temptations came upon me to throw myself into the midst of this pandemonium, like Faust visiting the witch's Sabbath, and I felt then that I should cry, gesticulate, posture, and laugh as they did. Oh, there is only one step from such a state of madness. I was horrified. I flung myself out of the place, pursued to the outer door by howls that were more like the amatory roaring from the den of wild beasts than anything else. It was then Anthony explained to Alexandre that he saw a carriage and a young woman in a costume hop out of it, desperate, and try to buy her way in. Unable to buy a ticket because she had no coin, she tried to pawn her ring, to no avail. Anthony picked up her ring and bought a ticket and accompanied her in to the masked ball. The young woman seemed upset, but Anthony was intrigued by her. He tells, "We re-entered this sordid bedlam. 3 times we went the round of it, forcing our way through the waves of masks which tumbled and foamed over one another, she wincing at every obscure expression, I blushing to be seen my arm to a woman who would listen to such words. Then we came back to the far end of the hall. She sank into a seat. I remained standing before her. Here the young woman explains to Anthony that she is only there searching for her husband, who has absconded with another woman. She loves her husband and is very jealous. Anthony offers to help her search. She explains to Anthony, these people are drawn here by madness and debauchery, but with me it is infernal jealousy. They look together until she spots who can only be her husband with another woman behind 2 masks. They pursue them, following them around the opera, up the stairs, and towards the boxes. The couple go into a box. Anthony and the young masked woman pursue them, she putting her ear to the box to hear what's happening behind the curtain. In the upper tier, Anthony tells her, come inside this next box. It will be easier to hear in there, and we won't have to stay outside. They entered the small private box and closed the door behind them. Anthony observed the young woman listening to the box next door. The poor creature on my arm frightened me by her agitation. I could not see her face, but pressed against me as she was, I could feel her heart beat, her frame shiver, her limbs shake. There was something strange in the way I became aware of these unheard-of sufferings. As Anthony watches her, listening for any sound from the box next door, he falls in love with her. He admires her form, her hands, her feet, her face, and says she must be a marvelous creature, happy the man who should be privileged to hold her in his arms, to see all the faculties of such a soul employed in loving him. Such were my thoughts when suddenly I saw my companion rise to her feet. Turning to me, she said in a broken and frenzied tone, Monsieur, I am beautiful, I swear to you. I am young, only 19. Up till now I have been pure. Well, here she threw both her arms round my neck. Well, I am yours, take me, she said. At that moment, I felt her lips on mine, kissing me wildly, despairingly. 10 minutes later, she was in my embrace. What Anthony and the young woman did in the box, we can only guess, but he emerged entirely besotted. However, the young woman remembered herself and said, "Forget everything that has happened between us. I will remember for both of us." She rushed away, saying, "Do not follow me, monsieur. Please do not follow." For 10 months, Anthony searched Paris. Every masked ball, everywhere he attended, searching in vain for this beautiful young woman that had captured his heart. He became entirely smitten and tells Alexandre that he never did find her. "I did not see her anywhere but at nights in my dreams. Ah, then she came back. Then I felt her. I was conscious of her embraces, her kisses, her caresses, so ardent that there was something infernal in them. Then the mask fell, and the strangest countenance appeared to me, sometimes blurred, sometimes clouded, now brilliant as if with an aureole about it, now pale with the skull white and bare, and the eyes in hollow sockets and teeth hideous and sparse. Since that night I have lived consumed with an insane love for a woman I do not know, hoping always and always, thwarted in my hopes, jealous without having the right to be so, or knowing of whom I should be jealous, not daring to own such madness, and yet haunted, consumed, devoured by it." As he finished his story, he showed Alexandre a note that had come for him. Alexandre took the note and opened it. Inside was a note from the beautiful woman. It read, "Perhaps you have forgotten a poor woman who has forgotten nothing, who is dying of not being able to forget. When you receive this letter, I shall be dead. Go to Père Lachaise cemetery and tell the lodge-keeper to show you the name of Marie. And when you find yourself before the grave, kneel and pray." Anthony, heartbroken, began to weep. "Do you realize it, Alexander? I love her still. I love her madly. I would kill myself to be with her again. Yet she must remain unknown to me for all eternity, as she was in this world." Alexandre had no choice but to console his friend and weep with him. Edgar Allan Poe was no stranger to the spooky. Of the many stories he wrote, one of his short stories, titled Hop Frog, was a bit medieval, but had to do with a masked ball. The story is about a crippled dwarf who is a court jester named Hop Frog because his disability, because his crippling deformity made him walk doubled over. Hence the king gave him the nickname. The king was very abusive to Hop Frog, and he also had an insatiable sense of cruel humor. Hop Frog had a friend, a dancer, also a dwarf, but very beautiful, named Trippetta. Both had been taken away from their homeland. Hop Frog could not hold his alcohol, and the king knew this. So, at one party, he forced Hop Frog to drink several goblets full of wine. Trippetta sees Hop Frog's discomfort and doesn't like to see him suffering, so she begs the king to stop. However, the king threw a goblet of wine into her face in front of all of the members of his cabinet council. Such violence against Trippetta angered Hop Frog greatly. But all of the council members laughed at Trippetta's misfortune. But the king and all of his councillors instead just laugh at the expense of Hop Frog and Trippetta. As this gathering progresses, the councillors and the king end up asking Hop Frog for advice for their upcoming masquerade ball. Hop Frog suggests that they go as wild men or orangutans, and offers to help them with their costumes. These men love the idea of scaring their guests at the masquerade, and they all agree to wear tight-fitting trousers and tops that are saturated with tar and covered with flax to look like wild orangutans. Once dressed, they are chained together and led into the grand salon of masqueraders just after midnight. All of the guests are shocked and scared, and many think these men are real beasts of some kind. Several rush for the doors to escape, only to find that the king had insisted the doors be locked so that he could have a good laugh, and left the keys with Hop Frog. Amidst all this chaos, Hop Frog attaches a chain from the ceiling to the chain that's linked around all of the men in costume. The chain then pulls them up far above the crowd, assisted by Trippetta. As Hop Frog begins to perform, all of the guests think it is all part of the show. Hop Frog claims he can identify the culprits by looking at them more closely, so he climbs up to their level and shows his anger at them. He holds the torch close to the faces, and the men, in their flaxen suits, quickly catch fire. In less than half a minute, the whole 8 orangutans were blazing fiercely amid the shrieks of the multitude who gazed at them from below. Horror-stricken, and without the power to render them the slightest assistance. Finally, before escaping through a skylight, Hop Frog identifies all of the men in costume, burning, dangling. He says, "I now see distinctly what manner of people these maskers are. They are a great king and his 7 privy councillors, a king who does not scruple to strike a defenceless girl, and his 7 councillors who abet him in the outrage. As for myself, I am simply Hop Frog the jester, and this is my last jest." After that, Hop Frog and Trippetta escape and return to their faraway home whence they came. We can see how Arthur Rackham's wonderful illustrations with ink and wash have captured the spookiness, the grimness, the grotesqueness of Poe's story. Some believe that the influence for Poe's story of Hop Frog was based on another famous ball in the Middle Ages, a ball given by the French king Charles VI. It features the same kind of animalistic wild men, though it is not fiction, but it actually happened. The Chroniques of Champfroissart are a prose history of the 100 Years' War, written in the 14th century. They open with the events leading up to the deposition of Edward II in 1327 and cover a period up to 1400. They have been recognized for centuries as the expression of chivalric culture of 14th century France and England. Froissart was present at many significant events, such as the baptism of Richard II in Bordeaux in 1367, as well as the coronation of King Charles VI of France in Reims in 1380, and the marriage of Duke Jean of Berry. He also writes about the joyous entry of the French Queen Isabeau of Bavaria into Paris in 1389. He writes a history of chivalric exploits that took place during these wars between France and England, and his chronicles are amongst the longest works written in French prose in the late Middle Ages. They are preserved in more than 150 manuscripts, many which are richly illustrated, including the one in the British Library and the one in France at the Bibliothèque Nationale. Froissart is one of several chroniclers who wrote about the ball given by King Charles VI. Charles had attacks of insanity and was very mentally fragile. During a reprieve from his madness, he had the presence of mind to give his wife Isabeau guardianship of their children. She eventually did become guardian to the son, the future Charles VII, who was born in 1403, and he had granted her political power, ensuring a place on the Council of Regents. On the 28th of January, 1393, Isabeau held a masquerade at the Hôtel Saint-Paul to celebrate the third marriage of her lady-in-waiting, Catherine de Fastaverin. This was a widow's remarriage, and such an occasion was traditionally made fun of with mockery and tomfoolery, and was characterized with all sorts of license, disguises, disorders, and loud blaring of discordant music and clanging of cymbals. The organization of this ball fell to Hugues de Guisset, who was described as being cruel and fostering outrageous schemes. He organized that 6 young men, including Charles, the king, would perform a dance in costume as wood savages or wild men. These wild men were very popular in the Middle Ages as mythical men of the forest, with allusions to Greek satyrs and the festival of Bacchus, as well as having pagan origins throughout all of Europe. So in a way, they contributed to the atmosphere around the third marriage of a widow. These costumes were sewn onto the men, and they were made of linen soaked with resin, to which flax was attached, so that they appeared shaggy and hairy from head to foot. Masks made of the same materials covered the dancers' faces and hid their identities from the audience. In some accounts, the dancers were bound together by chains. Most of the audience didn't know that the king was also among the dancers. As the wild men chained together capered about, howling like wolves, one of the things that the king had done in his madness as well, they also would spit obscenities and invite the audience to guess their identities, while dancing in a diabolical frenzy. Charles's brother, the Duc d'Orléans, arrived with Philippe de Bar, late and drunk. As they entered the hall, they were carrying torches. Involved in the game, the Duke of Orléans held his torch above a dancer's mask to determine his identity, but a spark fell, setting fire to his flax-covered costume. Jumping about as he was on fire, he set fire to the next and the next and the next, and soon all the chained wild men were aflame. Isabeau, knowing that her husband was one of the dancers, fainted as the men caught fire. The king, however, was standing at a distance from the other dancers, near his 15-year-old Aunt Jeanne, Duchess of Berry, who quickly threw her skirt train over the king to protect him from the sparks. The scene soon descended into chaos. The dancers shrieked in pain as their costumes burned them alive, and the audience, many also sustaining burns, screamed as they tried to rescue the burning men. One of the chroniclers, the monk of Saint-Denis, wrote that 4 men were burned alive, their flaming genitals dropping to the floor, releasing streams of blood. Only 2 dancers survived, the king and the Seigneur Nantouillet, who jumped into an open vat of wine and stayed there until the flames had been extinguished. Dying at the scene were the Count of Joigny, Yvan de Foix, son of Gaston Phébus, Count of Foix. However, Aymery of Poitiers, son of the Count of Valentinois, lasted for 2 days with painful burns before he finally succumbed and died. Huguet de Guisset, the instigator of the entire affair, survived 1 day longer. The citizens of Paris, angered by the event and at the danger posed to the king, blamed Charles's advisers. A great commotion swept through the city as the populace threatened to depose the king's uncles and kill dissolute and depraved courtiers. It became known as the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of the Flaming Men, or rather, the Flaming Ball. This ball added to the impression of a court that had been steeped in extravagance, a king in delicate health and unable to rule, and a lack of leadership. This all contributed to the decline and fragmentation of the Valois dynasty. In 1407, the Duke of Orléans was assassinated because of vice, corruption, sorcery, and a long list of public and private villainies. This pushed the country into a civil war between the Burgundians and the Orléanists, which lasted several decades. The vacuum created by the lack of central power and the general irresponsibility of the French court resulted in it gaining a reputation for lax morals and decadence that endured for more than 200 years. Wild men, or savages, are usually depicted carrying clubs or sticks, and as living beyond the bounds of civilization, on the edge of society, without shelter or fire. Sometimes they're depicted as lacking souls or emotions. In Christian times, these wild men became a metaphor for a man who had not found God. Superstition held that long-haired wild men were known as lutins. They danced to firelight, either to conjure demons or as part of a fertility ritual. They lived in mountainous areas such as the Pyrenees. In some villages, charivari, at the harvest or planting time, dancers dressed as wild men to represent demons. They were ceremonially captured, and then an effigy of them was symbolically burnt to appease evil spirits. The church, however, considered these rituals to be pagan and demonic, but it could do little to prevent the populace from celebrating with wild men. Because this masquerade happened at the wedding of Isabeau's lady-in-waiting Catherine, whose third marriage it was, a connection has been made with the fact that the remarriage was often thought to be sacrilegious and was censured by the community. Common belief held that the sacrament of marriage extended beyond death, so a widow really shouldn't be remarrying. Thus, the purpose of the Bal des Ardents was twofold: to entertain the court and to humiliate and rebuke Isabeau's lady-in-waiting. Thus, the masquerade, or the Bal des Ardents, functioned to entertain the court as well as to humiliate and rebuke Isabeau's lady-in-waiting in an inherently pagan manner with wild men. This event also may have served as a symbolic exorcism of Charles's mental illness at a time when magicians and sorcerers were commonly consulted by members of the court. Ritual burning of evil demonic forces was not uncommon, as was evidenced by the Duke of Orleans' later persecution of the king's physician, Jean de Bar, who was burned to death after confessing under torture to practicing sorcery. And there we have 3 masked balls descending from Dumas and the 19th century fancy dress parties back through the spookiness of Edgar Allan Poe to the Middle Ages and the Chronicles of Froissart. We've seen the tragic, the gruesome, the hedonistic, and the merry, all in one night in these 3 masquerade balls in the study. My friend, I hope you've enjoyed yourself at the study's masked ball. I wish you a sleepy, dreamy, imaginative, restful of creatures and imagination, and most of all, fun and enjoyment. And when you wake, smile at the fun we've had. Be good to yourself, be kind to others, and, as always, be extraordinary.